The Arabian Peninsula, a vast, unforgiving desert where survival depends on grit, strategy, and sheer will. This is where our story begins. A land of warring tribes, shifting alliances, and ancient rivalries. But among the chaos, one man emerges. A man who would change the course of history forever. Abdulaziz ibn Saud. He was not born into power. He was not handed a kingdom. He had to fight for every inch of it. And before he could rule, he had to reclaim what was once his family's legacy. It was the late 19th century, and the House of Saud was in exile. Their ancestral lands, their seat of power gone. Riyadh, the heart of their domain, had been taken by the rival Al-Rashid clan. Abdulaziz, a young prince with fire in his veins, grew up in Kuwait, watching, waiting, and planning his return. Then in 1902, at just 26 years old, he saw his chance. With a small band of warriors, no more than 60 men, he embarked on a mission that seemed impossible. His target? The Masmak fortress, the stronghold of his enemies. Under the cover of darkness, Abdulaziz and his men crept towards the fortress. They moved like shadows across the sand, every footstep calculated, every breath controlled. They knew one mistake could cost them everything. Then came the moment. A silent signal, a rush of movement, and suddenly, the fortress was under siege. The guards, caught off guard, barely had time to react before swords clashed and gunfire erupted. Abdulaziz himself led the charge, his sword flashing under the desert moon. It was quick, it was brutal, and when the dust settled, the fortress was his. Riyadh was his. Word spread like wildfire. The young prince had done the unthinkable. He had taken back his home. But this was just the beginning. Abdulaziz knew that taking a city was one thing. Holding it? That was another battle entirely. Enemies surrounded him. The Al-Rashid clan would not let Riyadh go so easily. They would come for him, and they would come with force. But Abdulaziz was not afraid. He was a warrior, a strategist, and a leader who inspired loyalty. With his growing army and the support of the Bedouin tribes, he began his campaign. A campaign that would take 3 decades to complete. The desert became both his battlefield and his home. Sandstorms, scorching heat, and the treacherous landscape were constant threats, but Abdulaziz adapted. He learned to use the desert to his advantage, striking swiftly, retreating into the dunes when necessary, and outmaneuvering larger, better-equipped forces. His men, hardened by years of fighting, grew fiercely loyal, willing to follow him to the ends of Arabia. Each battle was more than just a fight. It was a test of endurance, strategy, and willpower. Abdulaziz was not just conquering cities, he was uniting people. With every victory, more tribes swore allegiance to him, drawn to his vision of a united Arabian Peninsula. He was not just a warlord, he was a leader with a purpose. By 1913, his conquests had expanded to the eastern province, securing control over the Persian Gulf coastline. This was a crucial victory, granting him access to trade routes and resources that would strengthen his growing empire. Yet, the greatest challenge lay ahead: the Hijaz. The Hijaz was not just another territory, it was home to Mecca and Medina, the holiest cities in Islam. Controlling it meant not only political dominance, but also religious legitimacy. The region was ruled by Sharif Hussein, the Hashemite leader who had allied with the British during World War I. Taking the Hijaz would require careful planning and delicate diplomacy. Abdulaziz bided his time, watching as global events unfolded. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I left a power vacuum in the region. In 1924, he made his move. His forces advanced into the Hijaz, and after a series of decisive battles, Mecca fell. By 1925, Medina and Jeddah followed. The Hashemite rule was over. The Arabian Peninsula was now his. On September 23, 1932, he did what no one else had done before. He declared the birth of a new nation, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was a land united, a land forged in blood, sweat, and strategy. And at its helm stood Abdulaziz ibn Saud, the warrior king who had defied the odds, reclaimed his homeland, and built an empire. But what came next would change everything. Because deep beneath the sands of Arabia, a secret was waiting to be discovered. A secret that would turn this desert kingdom into one of the richest nations on earth. What Abdulaziz had fought for was now his. But to rule a land was one thing, to build a nation was another challenge entirely. The new kingdom of Saudi Arabia was vast, but it was also poor. Infrastructure was almost non-existent. Cities were little more than dusty settlements, and the economy relied almost entirely on pilgrimage revenue and trade. There were no modern roads, no industries, and no formal government structure. Abdulaziz knew that if his kingdom were to survive, it had to change. He began by consolidating his rule, ensuring stability among the various tribes that now fell under his domain. He implemented a system of governance based on Islamic law and tribal traditions, creating a balance that would maintain order in a deeply conservative society. But still, there was the question of resources. How would this new kingdom sustain itself? At first, Abdulaziz looked to outside investments. He sought financial aid from the British, but they saw little value in the barren lands of Arabia. The search for economic stability seemed bleak until a fateful event in 1938. Geologists from Standard Oil of California had been surveying the land for years, searching for something that many believed did not exist: oil. And then, in the eastern province, near Tehran, they struck black gold. The discovery of oil would change Saudi Arabia forever. But that is a story for another chapter. The year was 1938. Saudi Arabia was still a young nation, struggling to build an economy out of the harsh desert sands. The kingdom's primary sources of income were pilgrimage fees and trade, but these were not enough to sustain a growing nation. Abdulaziz ibn Saud knew that if his people were to thrive, they needed something more, something bigger. That something lay deep beneath the surface. And the world was about to find out. For years, geologists had speculated about the possibility of oil in the Arabian Peninsula. The region's geological structure hinted at vast underground reservoirs, but there was no proof. Many Western experts dismissed the idea, convinced that Saudi Arabia was little more than a barren wasteland. But Abdulaziz had a vision. He invited Western companies to explore the land, striking a deal with Standard Oil of California. 7 began gushing crude oil. It was a moment that changed history. The barren land beneath Saudi Arabia was not barren at all. It held some of the largest oil reserves ever discovered. News of the discovery spread quickly. Almost overnight, the fate of the kingdom was transformed. Oil meant power. Oil meant wealth. And Abdulaziz knew exactly what to do next. Foreign investment poured in. Roads were built. Ports expanded. What had once been a land of tribal settlements and small towns was now the epicenter of a global economic revolution. The American Oil Company, now known as Aramco, worked with the Saudi government to extract and export this new resource. Tankers filled with Saudi crude began their journey across the world. The world needed oil, and Saudi Arabia had plenty of it. But with great wealth came great challenges. The influx of money created new opportunities, but it also brought problems. How would the wealth be distributed? Who would control it? And how would Saudi Arabia navigate its growing influence on the world stage? Abdulaziz was determined to ensure that his kingdom did not become a pawn of foreign powers. He renegotiated contracts, securing a 50-50 profit-sharing agreement with Aramco in the 1950s. This landmark deal ensured that a significant portion of the wealth stayed within the kingdom. As Saudi Arabia's oil production skyrocketed, so did its global importance. The United States and Europe now relied on Saudi oil to fuel their economies. The kingdom, once seen as an isolated desert land, had become a key player in global politics. By the late 1950s, the transformation was undeniable. Saudi Arabia was no longer just a kingdom in the desert. It was an emerging powerhouse, a land of riches, and a force to be reckoned with. But this was only the beginning. The oil boom had set the stage for a new era, one of modernization, expansion, and geopolitical dominance. The sudden influx of oil wealth meant that Saudi Arabia had to evolve rapidly. Infrastructure projects skyrocketed. Roads, highways, and entire cities were built almost overnight. The kingdom, once reliant on camel caravans and small trade routes, now had access to modern transportation, communication, and technology. The money flowing into Saudi coffers allowed for rapid development, but with this growth came new risks. Would Saudi Arabia remain in control of its oil wealth? Or would foreign interests seek to dictate its future? The 1950s and 1960s saw the kingdom walking a fine line between maintaining its sovereignty and leveraging foreign expertise. American and British engineers helped build the refineries, but Abdulaziz ensured that Saudi interests always remained at the forefront. He knew that the real power was not just in extracting oil, but in controlling who benefited from it. This era also marked the rise of Aramco. As more than just an oil company, it became the backbone of Saudi Arabia's economy. Schools, hospitals, and public services were funded by oil revenues. Saudi citizens saw their standard of living improve dramatically. The kingdom, once a desert outpost, was turning into a modern state. But with modernization came cultural shifts. Traditional tribal structures had to coexist with new urban centers. Religious and political leaders had to navigate the balance between progress and tradition. Abdulaziz, a ruler known for his pragmatism, understood that change was inevitable, but it had to be controlled. As the world entered the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had firmly established itself as an oil superpower. The geopolitical landscape was shifting, and with oil demand rising, the kingdom's influence on global markets had never been greater. But the real test was yet to come. A crisis was brewing, one that would shake the world economy and redefine Saudi Arabia's role in global politics. And when the crisis hit, Saudi Arabia would not just be a player, it would be calling the shots. The year was 1973. The world was changing, and Saudi Arabia was about to take center stage in a global crisis that would alter the balance of power forever. For decades, Western nations had built their economies on a simple assumption: oil would always be cheap, and it would always be available. But the reality was far more complex. Saudi Arabia and its fellow OPEC nations were growing tired of the West's dominance over global markets, and they were ready to shift the balance of power in their favor. Everything changed when war erupted in the Middle East. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War broke out. Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated attack on Israel, determined to reclaim land lost in previous conflicts. The war quickly escalated, drawing in global superpowers. The United States and other Western nations openly supported Israel, providing military aid and supplies. This move infuriated the Arab world, and Saudi Arabia saw an opportunity to use its most powerful weapon, not guns, not missiles, but oil. King Faisal, a shrewd and strategic leader, understood the leverage his nation held over the global economy. Oil had become the lifeblood of modern civilization, fueling cars, planes, and industries across the world. If Saudi Arabia and its allies cut off that supply, the economic repercussions would be catastrophic. And so they did. In a historic move, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OAPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, announced an oil embargo on the United States and other nations that had supported Israel in the war. The effects were immediate and devastating. In America, gas stations ran dry. Motorists waited in lines stretching for miles, desperate for fuel. Prices at the pump skyrocketed, quadrupling almost overnight. Businesses suffered. Factories shut down. Inflation soared. The stock market plummeted. The world, which had taken cheap energy for granted, was now at the mercy of oil-rich nations. For the first time in history, Saudi Arabia was not just an oil supplier, it was a global power broker. The embargo proved that the kingdom could dictate terms to the world's largest economies, and those economies had no choice but to listen. But with great power came great wealth, and with great wealth came difficult questions. What would Saudi Arabia do with its newfound riches? How would it manage its rapid economic growth? Could it maintain control over its own resources, or would foreign interests attempt to reclaim their influence? King Faisal had no intention of letting others control Saudi oil. He was determined to ensure that the wealth of the kingdom stayed in Saudi hands. He renegotiated contracts, increasing the Saudi government's stake in Aramco, the American-run oil company operating in the kingdom. By the late 1970s, Aramco was no longer just an American business, it was a Saudi national asset. This was a turning point in Saudi history. The country had seized full control over its most valuable resource. With billions of dollars now flowing into the kingdom, Saudi Arabia embarked on an unprecedented transformation. Entire cities were built almost overnight. Skyscrapers rose from the desert. Modern highways stretched across the kingdom. Schools, hospitals, and universities sprang up as the government invested heavily in infrastructure and social development. The oil boom also brought extravagant wealth to the royal family and the elite. Opulent palaces, private jets, and fleets of luxury cars became symbols of Saudi prosperity. But Faisal understood that oil wealth alone was not enough. He believed in investing in the future, ensuring that the kingdom would not only rely on oil, but also develop other sectors of its economy. However, not everyone in Saudi Arabia welcomed this rapid modernization. Conservative religious leaders feared that Western influence would corrupt traditional Islamic values. They viewed the economic boom with suspicion, worried that with wealth would come a loss of cultural identity. Faisal, always a pragmatic leader, walked a delicate tightrope modernizing Saudi Arabia while maintaining its deep-rooted religious and cultural traditions. But just as Saudi Arabia was cementing its place as a global economic powerhouse, tragedy struck. In 1975, King Faisal was assassinated. His own nephew, Prince Faisal bin Musaad, entered the royal court and shot him at point-blank range. The assassination shocked the nation. The reasons behind the attack remain debated to this day, but the impact was undeniable. Saudi Arabia had lost one of its most visionary leaders at a critical moment in its history. Despite this devastating loss, the kingdom pressed forward. The embargo had forever changed the world's relationship with oil, and Saudi Arabia had proven itself as a major global player. The Saudi leadership continued to strengthen its grip over the oil industry, using its vast wealth to solidify its influence not only in the Middle East, but across the world. By the late 1970s, Saudi Arabia was not just an oil-rich nation. It controlled the largest known reserves of crude oil on the planet, and its economy was booming. The wealth accumulated from the embargo allowed Saudi Arabia to invest in massive projects, further modernizing its cities and infrastructure. The kingdom had emerged from the crisis not as a victim, but as a superpower in the making. However, the world was watching. Western nations having felt the sting of the oil embargo, began looking for alternatives. The United States ramped up its domestic oil production. Europe and Japan invested in energy-efficient technologies. The global economy was shifting, and Saudi Arabia had to adapt. The next decade would bring new challenges: fluctuating oil prices, shifting political alliances, and growing international scrutiny. The kingdom had won the oil war of the 1970s, but the battles ahead would be even more complex. Saudi Arabia was no longer just a kingdom in the desert. It was a global powerhouse, a nation that had demonstrated its ability to change the course of world history. But as the world changed, so too would the challenges it faced. The kingdom had secured its place on the world stage. The question now was, could it hold on to its power? The 1980s were a defining decade for Saudi Arabia, a time of economic turbulence, geopolitical shifts, and critical decisions that would shape the kingdom's future. The country had emerged from the 1970s as an oil superpower, its vast reserves fueling an economic boom that transformed its cities and infrastructure. But as the world changed, so did the challenges Saudi Arabia faced. As the decade began, Saudi Arabia's economy was still riding the high of the 1970s oil boom. However, trouble was brewing beneath the surface. The 1973 oil crisis had taught the world a painful lesson. Dependence on Middle Eastern oil came with risks. Western nations, particularly the United States, began exploring alternatives, boosting domestic production, increasing fuel efficiency, and investing in alternative energy sources. Then came the 1980s oil glut, a combination of declining demand, increased production from non-OPEC nations, such as the U.S., Mexico, and the North Sea countries, and OPEC's internal disagreements led to a massive drop in oil prices. What had once been selling at nearly $40 per barrel in 1980 plummeted to under $10 by 1986. For Saudi Arabia, this was an economic disaster. The kingdom relied on oil revenue for more than 90% of its budget, and suddenly, those revenues were shrinking. The government faced tough choices. Should it cut production to raise prices, or should it maintain high output to protect market share? Initially, Saudi Arabia attempted to limit production, hoping that reducing supply would push prices back up. But this strategy backfired. Other OPEC members, particularly Iran and Iraq, who were locked in a brutal war, refused to cut their production, choosing instead to pump as much oil as possible to finance their military campaigns. This left Saudi Arabia in a difficult position. Realizing that cutting production only resulted in lost market share, the kingdom made a bold decision in 1986. It flooded the market with oil, driving prices even lower, but forcing OPEC members and competitors to feel the same economic pain. This move eventually pressured OPEC into rethinking its strategy, but the damage was done. The Saudi economy was suffering, and it was clear that relying solely on oil was dangerous. The economic crisis of the mid-1980s was a wake-up call. King Fahd, who had ascended the throne in 1982, recognized that Saudi Arabia needed to diversify its economy. He launched ambitious projects aimed at developing industries beyond oil, investing in sectors such as petrochemicals, manufacturing, and agriculture. New industrial cities, such as Jubail and Yanbu, were developed to support the petrochemical industry, reducing Saudi dependence on crude oil exports by refining and processing more oil domestically. The Saudi Basic Industries Corporation, SABIC, became a key player in this initiative, growing into one of the world's largest petrochemical companies. Agriculture was another area of focus. Using its newfound wealth, Saudi Arabia invested in desert irrigation projects, transforming parts of the arid landscape into fertile farmland. The government subsidized wheat production, and by the late 1980s, the kingdom had gone from importing wheat to becoming one of the world's top wheat exporters, a remarkable yet controversial achievement given the country's water scarcity. However, diversification was slow. Saudi Arabia was still heavily reliant on oil, and despite efforts to build new industries, the global economic downturn and fluctuating oil prices meant that real progress would take time. Meanwhile, geopolitical tensions were adding new layers of complexity to the kingdom's challenges. The Iran-Iraq War, which raged throughout the decade, had a profound impact on Saudi Arabia. Though officially neutral, the kingdom feared the spread of Iranian revolutionary ideology and quietly supported Iraq, providing financial aid and logistical support to Saddam Hussein's regime. This alliance, however, was not without consequences. As the war dragged on, Iraq accumulated massive debts, some of which were owed to Saudi Arabia. Relations between the two nations would become strained in the years to come. Meanwhile, the kingdom's relationship with the United States remained strong. The U.S. had become increasingly reliant on Saudi Arabia as a strategic ally in the Middle East, particularly in countering Soviet influence during the Cold War. The 1980s saw deeper military cooperation, with American arms sales to the kingdom increasing significantly. The Saudi military was modernized with advanced weaponry, and the kingdom became an important regional power. Despite its strong alliance with the United States, Saudi Arabia faced growing internal unrest. The rapid modernization of the previous decades had created tensions within the kingdom. Many conservative religious groups felt that the leadership had gone too far in embracing Western technology, business practices, and culture. The Saudi government had to navigate a delicate balance between progress and tradition, ensuring that economic reforms did not alienate powerful religious institutions. One of the most significant moments of the decade came in 1979, when the Grand Mosque in Mecca was seized by religious extremists. Though this event took place before the 1980s, its aftermath shaped Saudi policies for years to come. The kingdom responded by enforcing stricter interpretations of Islamic law, reinforcing the power of religious authorities, and increasing censorship to maintain social stability. As the 1980s came to a close, Saudi Arabia had successfully weathered an economic storm, but new challenges were on the horizon. The collapse of oil prices had forced the kingdom to rethink its economic future. And while some progress had been made in diversification, much work remained. The Iran-Iraq War had left the region unstable, and tensions with Iraq were growing. Meanwhile, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan had drawn Saudi Arabia into another complex geopolitical battle, as it funneled money and support to Afghan resistance fighters. Saudi Arabia was no longer just an oil-rich kingdom, it was a central player in the political and economic affairs of the world. But as the 1990s approached, new conflicts and economic struggles loomed on the horizon, threatening to upend everything the kingdom had built. The 1990s began with a crisis that would test Saudi Arabia's role as a regional power and reshape its relationship with the world. The Gulf War, one of the most significant conflicts in modern Middle Eastern history, placed the kingdom at the center of global attention. It was a time of high-stakes diplomacy, military confrontation, and internal reckoning for the Saudi leadership. On August 2, 1990, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, launched a sudden and brutal invasion of Kuwait. The small but wealthy Gulf nation, a major oil producer and longtime Saudi ally, was quickly overrun. Within hours, Iraqi forces had taken control of the country, and Saddam declared Kuwait a province of Iraq. The move sent shockwaves through the region, raising fears that Iraq's aggression wouldn't stop there. Saudi Arabia, sharing a long border with Iraq, was now in direct danger. The possibility of an Iraqi invasion of Saudi oil fields was no longer theoretical, it was a real and immediate threat. The kingdom's leadership faced a crucial decision: should they seek outside help to protect their borders, or should they try to deal with Saddam through diplomatic means? King Fahd and his top advisors wasted no time. They understood that Iraq's ambitions extended beyond Kuwait. If Saddam was willing to seize one oil-rich neighbor, there was little stopping him from turning his attention southward. Saudi Arabia had one of the largest oil reserves in the world, and if Iraq controlled them, it would hold unprecedented power over global energy markets. The kingdom had to act fast. In an unprecedented move, King Fahd made the controversial decision to invite American and allied forces into Saudi Arabia. It was the first time foreign troops had been officially stationed in the kingdom since its formation. To some, this was a necessary act of self-preservation. To others, it was a betrayal of Arab sovereignty, one that would have lasting consequences. The decision was not made lightly. Saudi leaders, wary of the political and religious backlash, sought legitimacy for their actions. Clerics were consulted, and fatwas were issued to justify the move. The government argued that allowing American troops onto Saudi soil was essential to protect the two holiest cities of Islam, Mecca and Medina, from the threat of Saddam's forces. Operation Desert Shield, the first phase of the military response, saw hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops arrive in Saudi Arabia. American forces set up bases, positioned air defense systems, and coordinated efforts with the Saudi military to ensure the kingdom's security. The Saudi Royal Air Force and ground troops worked alongside coalition forces, playing a critical role in intelligence gathering and logistical support. As tensions escalated, the world braced for war. On January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched. A relentless bombing campaign pounded Iraqi military targets, crippling Saddam's forces and preparing the battlefield for the ground invasion. For weeks, the skies over Iraq and Kuwait were lit up with missile strikes and air raids. The superior firepower of the coalition forces was overwhelming, and within days of the ground invasion, Iraqi troops began retreating. By February 28, 1991, the war was over. Kuwaiti sovereignty was restored, and Saddam's forces were pushed back into Iraq. The rapid and decisive victory solidified Saudi Arabia's role as a key regional power, proving that the kingdom was not just an oil giant, but also a strategic player in global security. Saudi Arabia's role in the war did not go unnoticed. The kingdom had provided crucial logistical and financial support to the coalition, contributing billions of dollars to the war effort. Its military, though relatively untested in full-scale conflict, worked alongside coalition forces to ensure the successful defense of Saudi territory. The kingdom's status as a trusted U.S. ally was reinforced, leading to a deeper military and economic partnership between Riyadh and Washington. But the war also left lasting scars. The presence of American troops in the land of Islam's holiest sites became a rallying cry for radical Islamist movements. Osama bin Laden, a Saudi national who had fought in Afghanistan against the Soviets, was among the most vocal critics. He and others argued that the presence of non-Muslim soldiers on Saudi soil was a desecration and a sign of Saudi Arabia's dependence on the West. These grievances would later contribute to the rise of Al-Qaeda and the events leading up to 9/11. Beyond the political and religious ramifications, the Gulf War had significant economic consequences. The war itself was costly, and despite Saudi Arabia's wealth, the financial burden of funding the coalition and rebuilding Kuwait strained the kingdom's resources. The 1990s saw fluctuating oil prices, economic slowdowns, and growing demands for domestic reform. The Gulf War also reinforced Saudi Arabia's status as an indispensable ally to the West. The kingdom's strategic location and vast oil reserves made it a linchpin in U.S. foreign policy. But this alliance came at a cost. While Western leaders praised Saudi Arabia's cooperation, many inside the kingdom felt uneasy about the growing influence of the United States in regional affairs. Internally, the Saudi government had to manage growing dissent. The rapid modernization and economic development of the 1970s and 1980s had led to rising expectations among the population, but the financial burdens of the war and the economic downturn that followed meant that promised reforms were slow to materialize. Youth unemployment began to rise, and dissatisfaction with government policies grew. At the same time, conservative religious groups, emboldened by their opposition to the presence of Western troops, pushed for stricter enforcement of Islamic laws. The Saudi government responded by increasing its support for religious institutions, funding Islamic education, and promoting conservative social policies to maintain stability. As the decade progressed, Saudi Arabia faced new challenges, balancing its conservative religious establishment with the demands of modernization, managing economic reforms, and addressing the growing discontent of a younger, more globally aware population. The Gulf War had solidified Saudi Arabia's role on the world stage, but it also exposed deep internal contradictions. The kingdom had proven it could defend its interests, but at what cost? The coming years would test whether Saudi Arabia could maintain its power and influence, while addressing the tensions that the war had left behind. By the late 1990s, Saudi Arabia was at a crossroads. The war had reshaped its security policies, its economy, and its relationship with the world. The rise of Islamist extremism, the increasing demands for economic diversification, and the changing global energy landscape all pose new challenges. Saudi Arabia had emerged from the Gulf War as a stronger regional power, but the stability it had fought so hard to maintain was beginning to show cracks. The kingdom's leadership knew that the 21st century would bring even greater challenges, ones that would test the very foundations of the Saudi state. As Saudi Arabia entered the late 1990s and early 2000s, the kingdom found itself grappling with a new and unprecedented challenge: terrorism. The Gulf War had reinforced Saudi Arabia's position as a regional power and a key ally of the West, but it had also ignited extremist ideologies that would eventually threaten the kingdom itself. The rise of Al-Qaeda, increasing internal dissent, and growing calls for reform forced Saudi Arabia to confront one of the most volatile periods in its modern history. The seeds of extremism had been planted long before the Gulf War, but the presence of American troops in Saudi Arabia during and after the conflict provided a catalyst for radicalization. Osama bin Laden, a former Saudi citizen and veteran of the Soviet-Afghan War, emerged as one of the loudest voices condemning the Saudi government's decision to allow foreign troops on what he considered sacred Islamic land. From exile, he built a network of jihadist fighters, trained in Afghanistan, with one ultimate goal: toppling what he saw as corrupt Arab regimes and driving Western influence out of the Middle East. Throughout the late 1990s, Al-Qaeda escalated its attacks against U.S. interests. In 1998, coordinated bombings at U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania killed over 200 people, and in 2000, Al-Qaeda operatives attacked the USS Cole in Yemen, killing 17 American sailors. While these attacks were directed at the United States, they sent a clear message to Saudi Arabia, as well. Bin Laden's network viewed the kingdom's leadership as complicit in the West's actions in the region. Then came September 11, 2001. The world changed in a single morning as 4 hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania, killing nearly 3,000 people. The shock of the attacks reverberated across the globe, but for Saudi Arabia, the implications were particularly severe. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals, immediately drawing scrutiny and accusations that the kingdom had allowed extremism to flourish within its borders. The Saudi government faced a wave of international criticism. Western nations, particularly the United States, questioned whether Saudi Arabia had done enough to curb extremist ideologies. Some argued that the kingdom's funding of religious schools and charities had indirectly contributed to the radicalization of young men who would go on to join terrorist organizations. The pressure on the Saudi leadership to act was immense. In response, Saudi Arabia took a two-pronged approach, one focused on cracking down on terrorist networks, and the other aimed at addressing the root causes of extremism. The government launched extensive counter-terrorism operations, working closely with U.S. intelligence agencies to track down Al-Qaeda operatives. Dozens of suspects were arrested, and security forces began dismantling extremist cells operating within the kingdom. But the fight against terrorism was not limited to external threats. In May 2003, suicide bombers attacked a residential compound in Riyadh, killing 39 people, most of whom were foreigners. The attack was a turning point. It marked the first major Al-Qaeda strike on Saudi soil and signaled that the kingdom itself was now a target. The Saudi government intensified its counter-terrorism efforts, leading to deadly clashes between security forces and militants throughout the early 2000s. At the same time, Saudi leaders realized that they needed to address the underlying social and economic conditions that had allowed extremism to take root. The government initiated a series of reforms aimed at improving education, creating job opportunities for young Saudis, and promoting a more moderate interpretation of Islam. Clerics who had once preached hardline ideologies were now being urged to condemn terrorism and support state-led reforms. The fight against extremism also forced Saudi Arabia to re-evaluate its relationship with the United States. While both countries remained strategic allies, tensions rose over issues of human rights, the war on terror, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. The war had created instability in the region, and Saudi leaders feared that the American-led intervention would only fuel further radicalization. Meanwhile, internal pressures were growing. The kingdom's rapidly expanding population placed increasing demands on infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Young Saudis, many of whom had grown up with access to global media and the internet, began voicing their frustration with the lack of political freedoms and economic opportunities. Calls for reform grew louder, and for the first time in decades, Saudi leaders were forced to engage in conversations about change. In 2005, after a long illness, King Fahd passed away, and King Abdullah ascended to the throne. Unlike his predecessors, Abdullah was seen as a reformist, someone who understood the need to modernize Saudi Arabia while maintaining its Islamic identity. He launched a series of initiatives aimed at expanding women's rights, improving education, and reducing the influence of extremist ideologies. One of his most significant reforms was the creation of King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KAUST, a research institution that welcomed both men and women, something previously unheard of in the conservative kingdom. Additionally, he introduced municipal elections, allowing citizens to vote for local government representatives for the first time in Saudi history. Yet, reform was slow and met with resistance from conservative factions. While progress was being made, the kingdom remained deeply rooted in its traditional values, making large-scale political change difficult. As Saudi Arabia entered the late 2000s, it had successfully contained the immediate threat of terrorism, but the underlying challenges remained. The kingdom had managed to preserve its stability, but it was clear that the next chapter would require even greater adaptation. Saudi Arabia was at a crossroads. The battle against extremism had forced it to confront its own vulnerabilities. But it had also paved the way for a new vision of the future, one that would be tested in the years to come. As Saudi Arabia entered the 2010s, the kingdom faced a new challenge: how to transition from an oil-dependent economy to a diversified, modern state. The lessons of the past had shown that global energy markets were unpredictable, and the country could no longer afford to rely solely on oil revenues to sustain its future. The government, led by King Abdullah until his passing in 2015, and later by King Salman, began implementing a series of reforms aimed at economic diversification, social modernization, and technological advancement. However, this transformation was not without obstacles. Saudi Arabia's economic dependence on oil had long been both a strength and a weakness. As the world's leading oil exporter, the kingdom had built immense wealth, but this wealth was fragile, tied to the fluctuating prices of crude oil. The global financial crisis of 2008 had already exposed vulnerabilities in the Saudi economy. But the real shock came in 2014, when global oil prices crashed. Prices, which had been above $100 per barrel, plummeted to under $40, cutting deeply into government revenues and forcing Saudi leaders to rethink their long-term economic strategy. The sudden collapse in oil prices forced Saudi Arabia to re-evaluate its fiscal policies. Government spending had reached record levels during the oil boom years, funding massive infrastructure projects, social programs, and military expansions. However, with declining revenues, the kingdom faced growing budget deficits. The Saudi government introduced austerity measures, cutting subsidies on fuel, electricity, and water policies that had long been considered untouchable. For many Saudi citizens who had grown accustomed to generous government benefits, these changes were deeply unpopular. This crisis laid the foundation for Vision 2030, an ambitious plan spearheaded by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, after his rise to power in 2017. Vision 2030 was a blueprint for the future of Saudi Arabia, aiming to transform the kingdom into a global investment hub, develop non-oil industries, and create a more open and dynamic society. It was a bold vision that promised a Saudi Arabia that could compete in the modern world, free from its dependence on oil wealth. One of the key pillars of Vision 2030 was the privatization of state assets, including the partial sale of Saudi Aramco, the world's most valuable company. In 2019, Saudi Aramco launched its initial public offering, IPO raising billions of dollars and marking a historic moment in global financial markets. The sale of shares in Aramco symbolized the kingdom's shift towards a more market-driven economy, attracting foreign investment and funding the projects envisioned under Vision 2030. Beyond the economic restructuring, Saudi Arabia also began investing heavily in technology, entertainment, and tourism. The government launched massive projects such as NEOMA, futuristic $500 billion city, designed to be a hub of innovation, artificial intelligence, and sustainability. The Red Sea project and the expansion of tourism infrastructure aimed to position Saudi Arabia as a premier travel destination, breaking from its traditional reliance on religious tourism alone. The entertainment industry, once heavily restricted, also saw major changes. For the first time in decades, movie theaters reopened, concerts featuring international artists were held, and sporting events such as Formula One races, WWE wrestling matches, and boxing championships were hosted in the kingdom. These changes were part of a broader effort to create a more open society and attract foreign visitors and investors. But modernization came with resistance. Saudi Arabia had long been governed by a delicate balance between modernization and traditional religious conservatism. The reforms introduced by MBS were viewed as radical by some conservative factions, who feared that opening up the kingdom to Western influences would erode Islamic values. The government, however, took a firm stance, cracking down on opposition while pushing forward with its reforms. One of the most symbolic changes came in 2018, when Saudi Arabia lifted the ban on women driving. For decades, the ban had been a symbol of the kingdom's strict gender policies, and its removal marked a major step toward gender equality. Women were also allowed to attend sporting events, work in more industries, and take on greater roles in business and government. While these changes were celebrated internationally, critics argued that deeper political reforms were still needed. Despite the ambitious push for modernization, challenges remained. One of the most controversial moments of this period came in 2018 with the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. The killing sparked international outrage, leading to intense scrutiny of the Saudi leadership and raising questions about human rights in the kingdom. Western governments condemned the incident, and relations with key allies, particularly the United States, became strained. Yet Saudi Arabia remained focused on its long-term vision. The country continued its aggressive investment in technology, artificial intelligence, and renewable energy, aiming to position itself as a leader in the post-oil world. The Public Investment Fund, PEA, of one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, poured billions into high-profile investments, acquiring stakes in companies such as Uber, Newcastle United Football Club, and major tech firms. The transition was far from complete, but the kingdom was determined to forge a new identity, one that balanced its deep-rooted traditions with its aspirations for modernization and global leadership. Saudi Arabia was also making moves to secure its energy future, launching initiatives in green hydrogen and solar power. Projects like the Sakaka solar power plant signaled the kingdom's recognition that the future of energy would not rely solely on fossil fuels. The economy, however, was not the only challenge. Saudi Arabia's regional influence was also being tested. The Yemen conflict, which began in 2015, had turned into a prolonged humanitarian crisis, with Saudi-led coalition forces engaged in a war against Iran-backed Houthi rebels. The war drained resources and led to growing criticism of Saudi Arabia's role in the conflict, both regionally and internationally. Meanwhile, tensions with Iran remained high. The two regional powers had long been rivals, competing for influence across the Middle East. Cyber attacks, oil tanker incidents, and drone strikes on Saudi oil facilities in 2019 further heightened hostilities. Saudi leaders had to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape while ensuring domestic stability. Internally, the Saudi government continued its efforts to engage the youth. With more than 70% of the population under the age of 35, the younger generation had different aspirations than their predecessors. Many Saudi youth embraced the changes, enjoying new freedoms, job opportunities, and cultural events that had never before been possible in the kingdom. However, they also demanded more economic opportunities and faster reforms. As Saudi Arabia moved deeper into the 2020s, the stakes were higher than ever. Vision 2030 was in full motion, but success was far from guaranteed. Could Saudi Arabia truly shift from an oil-dependent economy to a diverse, innovation-driven powerhouse? Could the kingdom maintain its rapid modernization while preserving its traditional identity? Saudi Arabia was at a crossroads. The choices made in this decade would determine whether the kingdom could successfully reinvent itself or whether it would struggle to escape the economic and political constraints of its past. The journey to 2030 had begun, but the real test was yet to come. As Saudi Arabia entered the 2020s, it faced a series of global and domestic challenges that would put its resilience, leadership, and Vision 2030 to the test. The COVID-19 pandemic, fluctuating oil prices, shifting geopolitical alliances, and continued efforts at economic diversification all played a role in shaping the kingdom's trajectory. While the government remained committed to modernization and growth, the road ahead was anything but smooth. The decade began with the world thrown into crisis. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the globe, shutting down economies, closing borders, and disrupting daily life. Saudi Arabia was no exception. The government imposed strict lockdowns, halted international travel, and closed religious sites, including the Grand Mosque in Mecca, a decision that had not been seen in modern history. The annual Hajj pilgrimage, which usually brought millions of visitors to the kingdom and contributed significantly to the economy, was severely restricted. The economic impact of the pandemic was immediate. Global oil demand plummeted as industries shut down and transportation came to a halt. Saudi Arabia, as one of the world's largest oil producers, found itself in a precarious position. The price of oil briefly crashed into negative territory in April 2020, forcing the kingdom to reassess its economic strategies. In response, the government introduced austerity measures, including tripling the value-added tax, VAT from 5% to 15%, and cutting back on some government subsidies. While these measures were necessary to stabilize the economy, they were deeply unpopular among Saudi citizens, many of whom were already facing financial hardships due to the pandemic. Yet, even in the midst of crisis, Saudi Arabia saw an opportunity. The pandemic accelerated global shifts toward digital transformation, and the kingdom pushed forward with investments in technology, artificial intelligence, and e-commerce. The government encouraged startups, supported fintech companies, and expanded digital infrastructure to align with Vision 2030's goal of making Saudi Arabia a leader in innovation. Despite the economic strain, mega projects like NEOM, the Red Sea project, and Qiddiya continued. Construction did not stop, and the leadership remained committed to positioning Saudi Arabia as a future hub for tourism, entertainment, and business. The Public Investment Fund, PIF, ramped up investments in global markets, acquiring stakes in companies during the stock market downturn, further diversifying the kingdom's wealth beyond oil. Beyond the pandemic, the geopolitical landscape was also shifting. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020 between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain, signaled a dramatic change in Middle Eastern diplomacy. While Saudi Arabia did not officially normalize relations with Israel, there were clear signs that the kingdom was reassessing its stance. Economic cooperation between Saudi businesses and Israeli firms quietly grew, and behind closed doors, discussions about future diplomatic ties continued. The kingdom also worked to repair relations with its Gulf neighbors, particularly Qatar. In 2017, Saudi Arabia, along with the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, had imposed a blockade on Qatar over allegations of supporting extremist groups and aligning too closely with Iran. However, in 2021, the Al-Ula Agreement was signed, ending the blockade and restoring diplomatic ties. This move was seen as a strategic shift as Saudi Arabia aimed to strengthen Gulf unity in the face of broader regional challenges. Meanwhile, tensions with Iran remained high. While both countries engaged in back-channel diplomacy, proxy conflicts in Yemen, Syria, and Iraq continued. Saudi oil facilities were attacked multiple times, including the 2019 Abqaiq Quraysh attack, which temporarily disrupted global oil supplies. The kingdom responded with increased military spending and closer security ties with Western allies, particularly the United States. However, Saudi U.S. relations faced new strains. Under the administration of President Joe Biden, Washington took a more critical stance on Saudi Arabia's human rights record, particularly in relation to the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi and the war in Yemen. While economic and security ties remained strong, the once unshakable alliance showed signs of tension. The Saudi leadership, in turn, began diversifying its global partnerships, strengthening relations with China, Russia, and other emerging economies. Domestically, Saudi Arabia continued pushing forward with social and cultural reforms. Women's participation in the workforce reached new highs, and more sectors of the economy opened up to female employees. The government promoted cultural festivals, international sporting events, and entertainment industries to position the country as a modern global destination. However, opposition to some of these changes remained. Conservative factions within the kingdom were uncomfortable with the rapid shifts, and while open dissent was limited due to government crackdowns, there was still underlying tension between modernization efforts and the country's deeply rooted traditions. As Saudi Arabia moved further into the 2020s, the big question remained: could Vision 2030 deliver on its promises? The economic diversification efforts were progressing, but the kingdom was still highly dependent on oil revenues. The challenge was not just about building new industries, but also about changing the mindset of an entire nation that had been shaped by decades of oil wealth and government subsidies. Saudi Arabia had come a long way from its early days as a desert kingdom, but its transformation was far from complete. The next few years would determine whether it could truly redefine itself as a global power in a post-oil world, or if it would struggle to break free from the economic and geopolitical forces that had shaped its history. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Saudi Arabia was no longer just reacting to global events, it was shaping them. As Saudi Arabia moved deeper into the 2020s, it was clear that the kingdom was no longer just an oil powerhouse, it was actively reshaping its global identity. The economic, social, and political changes introduced under Vision 2030 were beginning to take effect, and the world was watching closely. The kingdom's leadership, led by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, was determined to position Saudi Arabia as a leading player in international business, technology, sports, and diplomacy. However, the journey was not without its challenges. Saudi Arabia's push for economic diversification accelerated as the country sought to expand beyond oil. The kingdom invested heavily in technology, renewable energy, and infrastructure, ensuring that sectors like artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and fintech played a major role in its future economy. The Public Investment Fund, PIF, led the way, pouring billions into global companies while also backing homegrown startups. Saudi Arabia positioned itself as a potential hub for the next wave of innovation, competing with global powerhouses like the US, China, and Europe. One of the most ambitious moves came in the sports industry. Saudi Arabia made headlines worldwide as it aggressively invested in sports, acquiring top football clubs, hosting major boxing matches, and even launching the controversial LEV Golf Series, which challenged the dominance of the PGA Tour. The Saudi Pro League, once a minor regional competition, suddenly became a destination for some of the world's best football players, lured by massive contracts that rivaled those in Europe. This was more than just a financial play, it was part of the kingdom's strategy to rebrand itself as a global entertainment and sports destination. But not all of Saudi Arabia's moves were met with universal praise. Critics accused the kingdom of using sports as a means of sports washing, a way to divert attention from human rights concerns and political controversies. While Saudi leaders dismissed these claims, arguing that their investments were part of a long-term national strategy, the debate continued to follow the country's every move. Beyond sports, Saudi Arabia took a more assertive role in global diplomacy. Traditionally seen as a U.S. ally, the kingdom expanded its partnerships, deepening ties with China, Russia, and India. The signing of new trade agreements, military pacts, and economic deals signaled that Saudi Arabia was no longer solely reliant on Western powers. The kingdom also played a mediating role in regional conflicts, hosting peace talks and working to de-escalate tensions with Iran. The historic China brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran in 2023, which led to the re-establishment of diplomatic ties between the two longtime rivals, was seen as a major diplomatic victory